We were all told that it was NATO's eastward expansion that triggered Putin's invasion of Ukraine. That this graphic represents NATO's creep up to Russia's northern borders, which triggered Putin's paranoia and led to the invasion. But is that true? Is Putin really so threatened by NATO's eastward expansion that he felt he had no choice but to invade Ukraine? Or was there another reason why Putin really did it? I'm a U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So in today's video, we're going to do a deep dive into what really caused Putin to decide to invade Ukraine. And spoiler alert, it wasn't NATO. Okay? Let's talk about this idea that NATO somehow triggered Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And this is an idea that has been gaining traction among Russia apologists and China apologists in the West. They will say things like, "How could we have not seen this coming? The US has been provoking Russia by expanding NATO right up to their borders." This is a classic example of American exceptionalism. We just do what we want, and we don't care what other countries think. And frankly, it worked. Putin is now doing exactly what we all said he would. But that's not actually what happened. And most Americans just don't understand why this isn't actually what happened. So let me explain. So here's the thing. First of all, remember guys, we've got a new channel where we're talking about national security, geopolitics, the war in Ukraine, and more. We would love it if you went over there and subscribed. Okay, first of all, Putin didn't just suddenly wake up one day and say, "Oh my God, NATO is right outside my border. I'm so triggered I'm going to have to invade Ukraine." No, this idea that NATO expansionism triggered Putin has been around for a long time. He has been railing against it for over 20 years. And indeed, when we look back at some of his early statements, we see that he actually even supported NATO expansion up until a point. What he really cared about was influence over Ukraine. And that's not a controversial statement. If you go read the transcripts of his meetings from 2007, 2008, he says repeatedly that he's concerned about Ukraine joining NATO. And he doesn't say that it's because they rewrite on the border or anything like that. He specifically says it's because Ukraine provides a bridge between Russia and Europe. In fact, in some ways, he's actually supportive of Ukraine joining NATO. He says that it would help stabilize Ukraine and make them a better partner for Russia. So really, this idea that NATO expansionism was what triggered him is just completely false. In fact, he repeatedly has said that he has no problem with NATO expanding as long as Ukraine does and join. But okay, fine, we can argue semantics all day long, okay? Perhaps NATO expansionism didn't technically trigger Putin. Perhaps he already had his eye on Ukraine well before NATO ever expanded that far east. But doesn't that just prove my point? Putin has wanted Ukraine for a long time. If that's the case, why wouldn't we have expected him to invade Ukraine? Why did we all think that NATO expansionism would be what finally pushes him over the edge? Why did we not expect him to invade when he started threatening to invade over 15 years ago? Well, the answer, of course, is because we thought that our sanctions regime, combined with our diplomatic and economic pressure, would be enough to stop him. And sure, some of us warned that he might invade, but many of those same people also argued that we should continue to court Ukraine and bring them into the Western sphere precisely because we thought that that would deter Russia. Instead, what we should have done is we should have recognized that Putin's behavior is fundamentally irrational. It doesn't respond to rational arguments or evidence or even simple facts. And as such, we should have expected that if Putin wanted something, we really couldn't stop him from taking it. That if Putin decided he wanted Ukraine, that we wouldn't be able to stop him from invading Ukraine. Indeed, if we had been rational actors, this is exactly what we would have bet on. We would have bet that he would invade Ukraine. We would have expected it. We would have put serious defenses in place to protect Ukraine. We would have made sure that NATO was prepared to defend the Baltic states. We might have actually stopped the Russians if we had done that. Instead, we essentially bet that our sanctions regime, coupled with our diplomatic efforts, would be enough to stop him. And tragically, we were wrong. We can argue semantics all we want. We can argue whether or not Putin was literally triggered by NATO expansionism, whether or not that was the literal cause. But the reality is that it was absolutely the proximate cause of his decision to invade. And that means ultimately that we are to blame for not recognizing that that would cause him to invade. Now, again, some of us did warn that he would invade, but many of those same people also argued for continuing to court Ukraine, continuing to encourage them to move closer to the West, and that was fundamentally a mistake. Now, it's important to recognize that Putin's behavior here is actually fundamentally irrational. He does not act based on interests or values or ideologies. He acts based on a series of fears. His fear of Ukrainian nationalism, his fear of Western encroachment on his sphere of influence, his fear of the Ukrainian revolution being a so-called color revolution that would undermine his own legitimacy. These are all irrational fears. In fact, Ukraine is probably the most Russian country in the entire world. It's overwhelmingly ethnic Russian. Its population is overwhelmingly Russian Orthodox. And yet somehow, despite all of that, Putin seems to be terrified of Ukraine. In fact, he seems to be more afraid of Ukraine than he is of any other nation. Despite the fact that NATO nations have hundreds of billions of dollars worth of sanctions imposed on them, despite the fact that Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, all of these nations are members of NATO, he's not afraid of them. He's only afraid of Ukraine. Why is that? Well, it's because Ukraine represents the past. Ukraine is everything that Putin wants Russia to still be. And in many ways, Ukraine is what Russia used to be. And that is what scares Putin so much. When he looks at Ukraine, he sees everything that he thinks Russia should be: a thriving democracy, a prosperous market economy, good relations with Europe, and at least nominal good relations with the United States. All of that is what Putin wishes Russia could be. That's why he's so threatened by Ukraine. And that's also why he's been so determined to keep them in his own sphere of influence. It's not because Ukraine is a threat to Russia. In fact, Ukraine isn't even a threat to Russia's national security. In fact, Ukraine is a completely benign state that poses no threat to Russia. It's simply because Ukraine represents everything that Putin wants Russia to be, but Russia isn't. And as such, Putin fears Ukraine. And he knows that the more Ukrainian society becomes, the more successful Ukraine becomes, the more that Ukrainians identify themselves as Ukrainian versus Russian, the worse that is for Putin. And that's why he was so determined to keep Ukraine in his sphere of influence, and ultimately, why he invaded. So it wasn't NATO that triggered Putin. That was just the final straw. It was just the thing that pushed him over the edge. What triggered Putin was his irrational fear of Ukraine and what Ukraine represents. Guys, if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. You can also check out my podcast. Thanks to everybody who's supporting me. I appreciate you guys so much. I will see you in the next one. Cheers.